this book is also an exploration of modern life through the lens of it ending. And that's one of the things that I just kept coming back to is the perspective that the apocalypse gives us on what we currently have. If it were to all fall away, looking back at it, how would we feel about it? How would we feel about our modern lives and the things that we spend our time on? Welcome, friends, to episode 214 of the Ink to Film podcast. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Emily St. John Mandel's 2014 novel, Station 11. All right, here we are, season 6, James. I am super excited for this one. How you feeling?
I'm excited to be back.
Yeah.
I feel refreshed. I hope everyone forgives us for our long break. It always feels, it was only 2 weeks, but it feels like really, really long.
Hopefully absence makes the heart grow fonder, right?
Right. But I am genuinely ready to jump back into this season and starting with this project,
yeah,
I think has really been a part of that.
I do want to take a moment to welcome any new listeners that might be checking us out for the first time. Just a brief description of what we do here. I am a writer. James is a filmmaker. We both work in our respective industries, and we break down book to film adaptations, diving into the book first, like we're going to be doing today, talking about what we can learn from it as creators, and also just exploring deeper themes, what the writer may have been going for, and then we move into the adaptation, and we do the same there, and we compare the two, talking about the process of adaptation, and then at the end of each grouping of book and film, we make a decision for each of us, which was the better version. So you can look forward to that at the end of the HBO miniseries that we'll be discussing in the following weeks. We will make a determination on what we thought was the better version. But today's all about the book.
Better in the sense of we force ourselves to make that decision. We don't see ourselves as reviewers. We like to look at the material as creatives and kind of break down what makes these authors and filmmakers tick and sort of what their perspective was on these specific projects.
So hopefully you stick around through the entire project and hear that. But anyway, yeah, today's all about this book by Emily St. John Mandel. And we're going to start off talking general thoughts. We always begin with a sort of spoiler-free discussion. Then we move into talking about the bio, what's known. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. Just a few minutes, at least, talking about the person behind what we're covering. And then we move into our spoiler discussion, which we will clearly say, okay, going into spoilers now. So if you haven't read this book, if you haven't seen the show at all, and you're just curious, you're still safe. We'll let you know when you're not. That's basically what we do here. And we have a good time, and sometimes we have guests on, and we'd love to have you stick around. And you can look back through our episodes. We consider them evergreen. So you can go back and listen to them, whenever it is you come to a particular book or adaptation, because we definitely are like that. We sometimes discover things from a long time ago and talk about them in the modern times. So That's how it goes.
And we've been doing it for going on 5 years now, 6 seasons technically.
This is our sixth
this
season.
Year will be our 5th year at some point, midway through the year.
Yeah. Again, over 200 episodes. Okay, so that's enough about Ink to Film. Let's get into this thing. I'm really curious to know your general thoughts, but before we get into that, I just want to say this book is setting quite a bar for the year. It's holy cow, really, really high for me. I'm just curious to know, generally, what do you think of this book, James?
Yeah, so, interestingly enough, I feel like we're setting a trend with the beginning of our seasons this year and the last. We started with pandemic novels in a pandemic.
Sure did. Last year we started with The Stand by Stephen King.
Yeah, and so, we've talked, obviously, at length about what it means to be addressing something that was written before a pandemic when we're currently living in one and seeing how people would react. But ultimately, going through this book, it's fascinating because a lot of the questions about life and art and what makes people happy. I think a lot of people are thinking about these things currently, changing jobs, the great, resignation, and all of the things that people have talked about. But even like more personally for myself, the way that this book addresses art and what's important in life in a creative sort of sense, with art being performance or writing or acting, there's some film stuff, like the way that people have to go about their lives and weigh their day jobs and if that satisfies them versus the things that creatively interest them and how they can express themselves, and this balance that some people strike, and the way that at times in my own personal life I felt like, I might not be doing work that feels as fulfilling, but also you need to put food on the table, but also you need to, creatively explore yourself. And that this novel being a dystopian novel, that's kind of the pull into the story. You're expecting to be driven along by that sort of plot. But in this case, I was really struck by like how much it was digging into like the psychology of what goes on in everyday life, and then also what would potentially happen in a pandemic. And then that leads into all these little vignettes of what I thought the story was going in. Like it sort of sets this idea that it's going to give you different periods throughout a pandemic. And I thought that they were going to be sort of less connected, but as time goes on, these threads sort of form together to create this like strong narrative weave that I thought was really interesting, and it kept me guessing for a lot of the way through.
You're talking about a little bit about the structure, right? And how the story plays out.
This is sort of a literary version take on a dystopian pandemic sort of fallout of society. Some people say like 98% of the population dies off, and
I think
so
in the
like,
book it's 99.9 actually. I think that's the stat that's
nearly everyone.
Yeah. It's not the first time there's been a literary look at post-apocalyptics, and in fact, Emily St. John Mandel mentioned The Road by Cormac McCarthy as something that is kind of an influence on this book, which I can see. So
it's the first that I've personally read. We tend to cover literary novels throughout the podcast, and a lot of them I'm finding to be really rich and interesting, and with many layers, and the ways that I'm thinking specifically of I'm thinking of Ending Things, which we covered last year, and the philosophical ways that it explores life, and then like this story in particular, the normalities of life and things that we take for granted, and the ways that like it just gives good perspective. And then obviously having this novel being written in 2014 and then having lived through a pandemic, the way that it's giving good perspective about things to be thankful for.
Yeah.
And just like how, this was not the worst case scenario. Maybe that is possible. And, there's lessons to be learned there, but just the foresight to write a novel like this, I was overall, I was just completely enthralled, and the plot kept me guessing. And then on top of that, a lot of philosophical perspectives I hadn't thought of in terms of, life and art. And I found that to be really engaging.
So yeah, for me, man, this book is sad and beautiful and poignant and just hit me in so many levels. I was really taken with the mastery that is being displayed for a really young writer. I thought this book has an excellent structure that is complex, yet very meticulously crafted. I could feel intention behind the way the scenes transition from one to another. Her use of white space, her understanding of language and how to lend power to things by the way it is laid out within the book, the way that she positions her language within a sentence. I was really taken with that. It was approachable prose. Often when you talk about more literary leaning stuff, which I don't know if this would be considered full literary, but regardless, genre discussions can be interesting to people within the industry, but I feel like less interesting to people outside of it, so I don't want to talk too much about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, selfishly, it's interesting to me.
Yeah. She has said that she resists being called this novel being called science fiction. It won a science fiction award. Much like we talked about with Margaret Atwood. Her comments on it reminded me a little bit of Margaret Atwood. She says that she doesn't think this is science fiction because it doesn't employ any fictional science. And I don't know if that's a definition we all want to get behind, but regardless, it does feel more literary. Yet, when you say that, I think there's a perception that the prose is going to be somehow dense or so poetic that it is not approachable. And I did not find that to be the case at all in this book. I actually found it to be a really engaging, easy read. I felt like it had a pace to it I wasn't expecting because of her use of white space and because of you were talking about little vignettes. And that's not just within the chapters, that's within the subsections and the scenes. Like, you get these little moments, and it's scattered all throughout. And you take all of that and you keep it moving. And we're also jumping back and forth through time, which I don't think is a spoiler to say. That's part of the structure that's so interesting, is that you have really two different timelines playing out simultaneously and informing each other. And to me, the structure was based off of this like narrative importance. Like, it was more important to tell the story in the way that the book tells it than it was to follow things chronologically. And I think that's like the sign next level storytelling to me. So I was really impressed with that. And all that's to say that like, this book is expertly crafted, yet you have to deliver on what you're doing. And she does, because this book is also an exploration of modern life through the lens of it ending. And that's one of the things that I just kept coming back to, is the perspective that the apocalypse gives us on what we currently have. If it were to all fall away, looking back at it, how would we feel about it? How would we feel about our modern lives and the things that we spend our time on? And
especially living through a pandemic and knowing the severity of this one versus a fictionalized version of what could be the worst case scenario.
Yeah. And you know, like, this is the stuff that, like, I think everybody who is aware of the danger of pandemics was worried about when, like, COVID was really first starting to hit. Like, I know I had my like panic attacks over this shit, like thinking that maybe that was going this way. Luckily, not as bad as this, but, as a device, it grants this perspective of, you can look back at modern life and it gives you the ability to be very critical of a lot of things. But I like that it's not only that. It is critical, and it does look at things and go like, I can't believe we wasted so much time on this. But at the same time, it also celebrates things about modern life and celebrates things about our ability to engage with art and seemingly superfluous things. And we're not just surviving, right? And that comes back to that quote that is so central to this, and that survival is not sufficient, which is an important quote. So, I think that gets at the heart of what this book is about, and absolutely delivers. So, glowing recommendation from me. I love this thing, and it's going to be hard for something to beat it, honestly. I think at the end of the year, we're going to be talking about this book in last looks of 2022. That's my guess. Whether or not it's top spot, I don't know. You know, we have a whole year to go. We'll see. Maybe this is going to be a fantastic year. I hope so, of just amazing reads. But I think this is going to be in the conversation for sure.
I think it's something that can help, too, is like if the HBO adaptation is on the level of something like this and delivers on something like all the concepts that are built up in this and can deliver, especially, again, in 2022, still living through a pandemic, the ways that they can tweak things and adjust things and think about things in different contexts, and clearly they're speaking to us directly as a group of people who are still going through a pandemic. Like, they're going to be addressing that. I'm
going to be really interested to see what the HBO series was able to modify, knowing that they were coming out during COVID, right? Versus this book that was written in 2014. So before COVID was a thing. There's mentions of like the swine flu and some other pandemics that never hit the level of COVID. It's fascinating. I would have loved to like talk to her during COVID a little bit and find out what her thoughts are on it, because wow.
Yeah. And the underlying idea is that like the people who are acting in this show and the people who are producing the show are actively social distancing, wearing masks, like having to deal with all of the pandemic things in a show that's a fictionalized, like more extreme version. It's going to be very interesting to dig into.
So I have so many more thoughts and specifics that I want to get into, but we will save those for our spoiler talk. First, I want to tell you what little bit I could find about the author, Emily St. John Mandel. She is pretty young and fairly new, relatively, and because of that, there's not a ton out there. But here we go. So, Emily St. John Mandel was born in 1979, so approximately 42, 43 years old. She is a Canadian novelist and essayist. She has written numerous essays and 5 novels, which, in order, are Last Night in Montreal, The Singer's Gun, The Lola Quartet, Station 11, and then her most recent novel, The Glass Hotel, and then I think she even has an upcoming novel that has not been released yet. The Glass Hotel, by the way, was like a book of choice by Obama. He talked about like his favorite books of 2020, and this was one of them. So she's continuing to have this like fairly meteoric rise, but really I think that took off with Station 11. The novels that came before Station 11 were had similar discussions about what genre they were, because they were ostensibly crime novels, but she resisted that as well. She didn't want to be pigeonholed as a crime writer. And similar, when Station 11 comes out, people are like, oh, science fiction novel. And she's like, I don't know if that's a science fiction. She even calls it a theater novel. So I think this is something you see every now and then from authors not wanting to be pigeonholed. And I totally get that. I think sometimes it's like you can still embrace genre without saying like, I am a genre writer, as if that is somehow a dirty thing to be called. But I don't know if that's what she's trying to say, but I perceive that sometimes in these resistances of like, oh, don't call this a sci-fi novel, don't call this that. However, I will say, me and you both talked about it, and we were like, is this book science fiction? When we were trying to figure out like what genre, because we like to like cover different genres. So it's a legit debate to have, I think.
Right. And that's what I was going to say, is just like, I don't know that I would classify this as science fiction, having read the whole thing at this point. So I understand the distinction here for sure. Like, I don't think that if you walked up to somebody and said, here, read this sci-fi novel, like that's not really doing it due diligence.
Yeah. I mean, it is, it's really more about the post-apocalyptic genre, right? Is that a science fiction? Is that inherently a science fiction genre because the idea of an apocalypse and living through an apocalypse is getting into sci-fi territory? You know what I mean? Some people would argue yes. Some people would say that is not in and of itself a marker of science fiction. So yeah, we'll leave it up to you, listener, whatever you think. That it doesn't ultimately matter, right? Regardless, so she was born in Comox, British Columbia, to a Canadian mother and American father. She moved with her parents and 4 siblings to Denman Island off the west coast of British Columbia at age 10, where she was raised. I thought that was interesting because there is a certain characters talking about living in a specific island that is like a small town removed. And so I like when I saw that, I was like, okay, so she's touching on her own life for this, which we often see authors do. She's definitely doing that here. She also studied contemporary dance in the School of Toronto Dance and Theatre, and she lived briefly in Montreal before relocating to New York City, where she now lives, with her husband, who is also a writer and a playwright in particular. And she has mentioned in some of the interviews I was watching that she knows the sort of off-Broadway scene really well in New York, where there's a lot of these working actors who just are doing it for the love of the art because they're not making a lot of money on these productions. So I think that's all interesting background, right? Like she has this experience growing up in this small town, in this unique place. She studies dance, which is a very theatrical performance type thing. She's a writer, so she inherently is going to be studying art and thinking about the ways in which art leaves a legacy, interacts with culture. And then you also have this husband who works in theater. And so she has this, because clearly theater is an important thing. I guess not clearly if you haven't read the book, but theater is a very important thing in this book, as there's like a traveling troupe. And I think when she was writing it, I'm like, this has to be coming from firsthand knowledge. It didn't feel like something that you could just research. And sure enough, she does have this firsthand knowledge, at least and on that level. So it's a cool example of somebody who is writing what she knows, which is like an axiom, right? And write what you know. Yet she is writing about, an apocalypse through a pandemic, which like we all are a little more familiar with the idea of now. But in 2014, definitely not the case. So it's how you can start with things that you know, but then you can use some sort of speculative or storytelling thing that is outside your experience, but still has this core that's built on a foundation that is particular to you. And I think this is a great example of that. And it is, I think, also notable that this was her fourth novel, because it is such a sure hand. I was shocked because I was like, oh, is this a debut novel? Because I couldn't believe it. It's not. So that made me feel a little better, because it's like, okay, she had a little bit of practice getting up to this, because I just found this thing to be masterful. Yeah, I'm just really interested to know like what was it, the Glass Hotel. I'm curious what that book's like, and any upcoming novels she has. I'm curious about that. So, because I was really taken with this thing.
I said it before, but the foresight and I think probably swine flu played a part in that, because that was something that we lived through that, did kill a lot of people, and it was pretty severe. But like the foresight to know, as everyone we had heard, there's something bigger coming. A large flu is like one of the scariest things that you can deal with.
Speaking of Obama, he's the one who said that like that was the thing that kept him up at night when he was president, was worrying about a pandemic. And
clearly it's because you can't get people to listen,
as we have well learned. and that's one thing that this book doesn't really get into. And how could it, right? Like that, I feel like we definitely learned a lot going through COVID. And this book, and much like a lot of pandemic novels that I've read, it deals with the severe, fast-moving, like, act of God, you could call it, or natural disaster on just an unbelievable scale that strikes down society over the course of, like, days. And, like, we saw that in The Stand. We've seen that here. I don't know if it's laid out in The Road. I don't remember specifically how that apocalypse goes down. I don't think it is. I think we're just kind of in a post-apocalyptic world. But, there's all these post-apocalyptic fictions.
Outbreak, Contagion, World War Z,
I Am Legend, yeah. And we've talked about a lot of these, right? Often involve zombies, but not always. But regardless, it happens fast. And, that's very different than what we're actually living in. But because of that, you're able to sort of quickly get to the post-world life and talking about the comparison of the two. And she does that here. Yeah, that's her. I watched a few interviews with her. Really interesting person, very insightful. Loved listening to her talk about this book and talking about her influence of The Road. She mentions the Canticle of Leibowitz, which is a book I have not read, but I have heard about as being a big influence. Sounds like she is well versed on post-apocalyptic fiction, and yet this book is different in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that we can revisit as we go, right? Like the ways in which this is unlike other post-apocalyptic fiction we have consumed, because it's like a pretty common genre, right? Like in video games, of course, but then you also have like Mad Max and you have action stories. It's a very common genre in some ways, yet this feels special to me. And because it does things differently, and I think exploring how it's different and why it's different is going to get at the heart of this book.
Yeah, and you mentioned before, like this isn't necessarily the first literary post-apocalyptic story, but for me it kind of was. And one of the things that we're talking so much about post-apocalyptic, but at the same time, this story surprised me in the ways that it wasn't about the pandemic specifically, or at least the plot and the idea of the characters overcoming it and that sort of thing that you expect from a post-apocalyptic story like that. To me, it was almost like more fringe. Like it was like, let me use the post-apocalyptic setting to analyze the psyche of a human living through it in a way that I hadn't really experienced before. Because I think a lot of times, the idea of marauders coming and people being kidnapped and taken and child brides and all the stuff that this sort of has in the fringes, it's not as much about that. It ends up being when you're more invested in the characters. But I would say the first 80% of the novel is more just like an exploration of like how we got to this point and how characters are coping with it and how characters are sort of waxing nostalgic for their lives, and especially characters who lived through the small things that we see as insignificant that people latch onto, and the beautiful ways that the author is able to like explore that and describe that. Like I said before, it was just like it was a surprising perspective shift in a story like this that I wasn't expecting.
She does a thing that I haven't quite seen yet, where she really draws out the exploration of what it was like to live through the fall of society. And to me, that is always the most interesting part of these kind of books. Like I love those parts of The Stand. I find very interesting. Whereas Stephen King like leans into the horror of it. She has a very different goal in mind, I think. And it's like the horror of it is alluded to. And I can imagine that like horrific things are happening. But the characters we're following are very different kinds of people than I'm used to following, right? These are not badasses, for the most part. It's like, these are just everyday people. These are actors and performers and writers and business people and, a celebrity and like so on and so forth. And they are just trying to find their way, and like the complete confusion and disbelief that goes on, and the trying to wrap your head around it, and just how like unreal it would be. I think she does a great job of capturing that. And through these characters and their lives is able to explore a story that with really Arthur Leander is at the heart of it. And it connects from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic world, and plays out in this way where these little mysteries are set up and delivered, set up and then drawn out. And they draw us through the novel in a way that I again felt was masterful, and I think leans on that background she has in writing these kind of crime mystery books. That she would balk at being called that. But like, I think that shows someone who understands the value of mystery in fiction, and having like little mysteries that you are threading in that you then find out at different points in the book. Like, oh, that's an answer to that question I had from before. Where did that come from? Why is this the case? So there's all these things that just draws us through this non-linear story that still, for me, I never felt disoriented. I always felt like I understood the motivation. Like, you'd have a character look at a photograph, and then the next section would be in the time of the photograph. And it was like, that was like a film thing to me. I was like, filmmakers do this all the time.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I specifically wanted to like bring a certain section from the book and talk about it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about how cinematic that felt.
Yeah.
Because it is this moment where they're going back in time in a way that feels, like you said, so cinematic. It feels like you're going straight into the photo. The characters, Kirsten's looking directly at this photo of Arthur and I think Miranda. They go into the photo, and it's the moment of them like running out of they're somewhere. Some paparazzi snaps this photo of them running out of somewhere, and it talks about that night, and then proceeds to spend like an entire, I think there's like 9 parts, so like a ninth of the book in that past section. So it's in that way, it is so well threaded, and that transition felt like a film transition. It felt like the kind of thing that because like that's something visually that you can do to interestingly lead someone back into the past or something like that. And I was going to ask you, like, is that unique? Do you think that that's something that authors should do more of? Because to me, that's how I would feel like I could write a story, is through a film lens.
Yeah.
Like that's how I would envision scenes if I was going to write even a novel.
I think it's really cool, and it's something I've seen a little bit of here and there. It's definitely done. I do feel like this is a film influence on her, and she's even said that this is a book where she's like leaning on visual storytelling, because you have actors, you have performers, you have theater, and all this stuff. And so I think she's very. To me, that felt very much like how a film would do it. But you see authors do similar things. And motivate flashbacks. And I love that. And I think that is a great way to think of flashbacks, because often people don't like them in narration, because they feel like, I want to get back to the present story, and I hate having to go back in time. But she does a great job where I never felt that way. I was equally invested in both parts. And you're also not ever in any one section for so long that you really start to miss the other one, because you're going back and forth. And the way that she was able to keep it from getting too complex and too confusing It was amazing because, and I think those transitions are key in doing that. So it's something that I personally want to remember and I want to lean into, because when you're learning about writing, at least when I was, one of the things that I was told was that you can write a book chronologically, but when it comes time to like figure out the order of that you're going to present the narrative in, you should be thinking about it as like what's going to be the most impactful and best in service of telling a good story, not necessarily chronologically. And often I find that I tend to think chronologically, I tend to write chronologically, but it's nice to remember that that isn't always the best way to tell a story, or there could be better ways. And you can use devices like this to make it more seamless. And it's absolutely a lesson. We talk about things we trying to learn. Like, this is absolutely a lesson I'm going to carry with me. And we've seen a little bit in other places, but it just drives that home about how powerful that can be.
We've read Agatha Christie. We've read a novel like this, like you said, influenced by sort of like crime fiction, that sort of thrives on the propulsion of reveals and red herrings. And do you think that in all types of stories, those that's rewarding, and like, do you think readers engage with that because it's like these little puzzles that they can try to predict and track in their minds, and is that something to keep investment, or do you think that that doesn't need to be the case some of the time, and like a straight narrative might work better? Because to me, it reminds me of, like, to boil it down to something really basic, it reminds me of shows like Lost that people describe as like mystery box fiction. And is there like a critical mass? Is there a point at which you can't return from so much of these reveals? And I don't know, I guess my question overall is just like, do you think that there's a place for it in all fiction, or is it specific stories?
I think there could be. I think it's going to depend on if that's something that the writer wants to engage in. I do think having mystery is a good thing. Like, if everything is like as it seems and there's no mystery, the only mystery remaining is what happens next. And that in and of itself can be enough, right? That is still a mystery. What happens next? I want to know. But having these other little sub-mysteries, I think just adds like an overall magnetism to the story that draws you through. Like, because you even subconsciously sometimes don't even realize that you're trying to figure out, hey, what was this thing? What was this little detail? What did that mean? And that can be very hard when you're on the other end of like realizing when you're employing it in a way that's going to be interesting and not frustrating. And that's found in revision and really thinking critically about the reader's experience going through the book versus the author's experience, who knows the answer to all these questions. Now, to speak about a little bit about the mystery box thing, I think sometimes it gets a bad rap because we have experienced in pop culture mystery boxes that don't have satisfying answers. And when a mystery box leads to nothing, or leads to unsatisfying, or only leads to more mystery that just spirals out of control, that is, in my opinion, is not going to be satisfying. But that is not the case here. Like, I feel like all the mysteries by the end of the book were basically wrapped up, and they were satisfying. And if that's the case, I think it just adds to the thing, right? Like, and I feel really, it's about, do you feel satisfied when you get to the end of the book? And I did. Instead
of opening up a mystery, opening up a reveal, and then having it have another sort of little intriguing clue that's going to lead to something else, if you give like full reveals that are like shocking big moments, I think that's what people are looking for, right? Like we're about to get into spoilers, but like there's a big one that happens that I didn't see coming, and it was really satisfying. And getting like the finite, like, boom, here's a reveal, and that sort of mystery has been solved, and then moving on, it's intriguing because the mystery is satisfying. Like, we learn who someone is, and then it continues to ramp up to then us being more invested in the character, and then sort of a climax with them. I mean, and you're also like talking about how it was really smart of her to find mysteries that she could create narratively, and in not feeling like she's cheating us. The withholding of information that could have been given from the beginning.
and what to give at the beginning, what not to give at the beginning. There's a lot to actually break down here, but I think it's time to get into the actual plot of the thing so we can talk more specifics. So if you haven't read this book, check out now. We will be spoiling it, the entire book, but just know we highly recommend it, and you should read it. And at the very least, if you've seen the show and you kind of know what happens, and that way you're probably safe to continue on and get more of a feel for what the book's like. So during a production of King Lear at the Elgin Theatre in Toronto, Jeevan watches as the actor playing Lear, Arthur Leander, has a heart attack. Since he has begun training as a paramedic, Jeevan tries to resuscitate Arthur, but is unsuccessful. Instead, Jeevan comforts one of the child actors in the production, Kirsten. After leaving the play, Jeevan goes for a walk in the snow and receives a call from a friend who is a doctor in Toronto. He warns Jeevan to get out of the city as the mysterious Georgia flu is spreading rapidly and will soon become a full-blown pandemic. Jeevan loads up on supplies and goes to stay with his brother, Frank. Many of the actors, actresses, and others that had gathered to mourn Arthur's deaths die within the next 3 weeks. Okay, so there's a lot more that happens here early in the book, but I think this is a good place to stop because the setup. This is the setup. And this is the thing that we start with, the characters we're first introduced to, and mysteries that begin to pile up. What did you think of the start, with this beginning?
Yeah, this, I think, is part of the misleading the audience into thinking that it's going to be sort of more disconnected of a story. And I think that that's a good thing, because I really thought that this was just going to be like a snapshot. I think this happens in a lot of pandemic novels, right? You're seeing this is unrelated to the pandemic.
Yeah, like you kind of think that he's dying because of the disease. Like this is the first guy to die of the disease, but it's not.
It's not.
Yeah.
And so, and that has ramifications, but the way that the story then in the second chapter, I think, is basically saying like all these people would be dead within a week or something.
Yeah. So actually, let me stop you there. There's a particular line you're referring to, and I want to talk about it because I think it is interesting to look at from a storytelling perspective. It's the end of chapter 2. And at the very end of the chapter, she says, "Of all of them there at the bar that night, the bartender was the one who survived the longest. He died 3 weeks later on the road out of the city." And that's the first mention we get of this some sort of global thing. Well, it's not even said that it's global, but some sort of mass death. Other than that, we had just been following this weird event at a theater all the way up to that moment, and then she ends the chapter right there. And that is like knowing when you're sort of dropping a bomb on the reader, and giving that hook that makes you want to keep reading. And I think it's just really clever. Yeah,
and it worked. And I, reading into what I thought the first scene, that recontextualizes everything, right? Like you're like, oh shit, like this is again a vignette of one of the last nights of the pandemic. And we don't realize, I didn't think that Arthur was necessarily as famous as he was when we were first reading this scene. So that continues to create intrigue and like sort of where he was at as a professional at that time and a performer.
Well, it creates tons of questions too. We're talking about mysteries, like why this, the first chapter of a book is very important. And that is definitely the case here. This is an extremely important scene that we will come back to multiple times. Why? Why this scene, this guy, this random, it's such a weird thing to focus on. And yet it's the entire novel spools out from here, and then returns to here even eventually too. So it's really cool to see that. And again, you're creating that mystery in the reader who's wondering why this scene, why these people.
And I think it's signaling to you right away that for one, it's going to be so art centric, which is something that I've really enjoyed about this, because it allowed for pop culture references, literary references. It allowed for all of these things that I think there's a certain nostalgia that lives in the consciousness of the world right now. That, and really probably always, I just am seeing it because we're in the middle of it. And this nostalgia then will play out because they're performing King Lear, and the way that art plays a role in this. Eventually we get to the chapters with Kirsten, who is like in a traveling troupe of performers. And we learn eventually that Kirsten was a part of this King Lear.
Yeah, she's the child that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, so things start to connect in that way, right?
Right, which is exciting and fun. But just to analyze it from like the art perspective, like I think both of us have had this conversation before, but this idea of like art is legacy, right? Like art is what will outlast us all. Art is what a lot of people find fulfillment in, some people don't, which we actually get addressed in this story a few times. But for me, as somebody who does, like, that idea of art outlasting, art being the most important thing, because it is this true expression of, like, humanity, the way that it's just addressed in this story and the importance is brought is not only just fun, but it gives, like, a mythos and, like, an importance to not only the story that's being told, which is in itself art, like this novel that we read is art. So it's just, it's talking a lot about things that we think about a lot.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I have a lot of thoughts in this vein. And it's funny because I knew that that's what this book was about. Like, I'd heard that.
I hadn't, yeah.
And that idea is kind of trite in and of itself. It's like, yeah, okay, art's important. Art is, So, like, at first you're kind of like, shrug it away. You're like, yeah.
Well,
okay.
And then on top of that, people can kind of feel about like that about post-apocalyptic stories as well at this point. Like, if you walked up and said, this is a post-apocalyptic story, again, it's like, I've read plenty.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. But she does, I think, spotlight that early on and say, like, the troupe you're talking about, they know, like, they like to congratulate themselves that they're preserving art, and then they all, like, laugh about it because it's so ridiculous, right? Like, so she sort of lampshades that, but it is an important part of this book. And one other thing I want to address is that this can seem like navel-gazy creator stuff, right? Like a bunch of writers and actors and performers talking about how they're the most important people in the world, right?
Right.
And that can seem off-putting to people who maybe aren't in the creative arts, right? It's kind of like you talked about how Hollywood loves movies about itself and will tend to...
Loves it. Go look at all the nominated films, yeah.
Yeah, it reminded me, I was thinking about that. And this is gonna go right into that sweet spot too, it. However, in defense of it, art and entertainment, if we remove the word art from it a little bit, right? Like entertainment, the things we consume for our enjoyment, from TV shows to web comics to graphic novels and just things we read, obviously. All these things are both the byproduct and progenitor of culture. Not only are they coming out of us, but they also inform in all of our lives. And this book is all about that weird interplay and how when you remove so much of humanity and society, like, what's left, and how do we reconcile art that was made in a time that feels so disconnected from the present moment? And what is the point in even looking at it? What is the point in all of this?
Well, and I felt it was so bizarre in the ways that we are experiencing a story that is pre-pandemic at this point, and the characters within the story are addressing Shakespeare pre-technology and also living in an era of plague and all of these other. So, like, the story is looking back at something like Shakespeare's era, and we're looking back at this era, which is pre-pandemic for us as well. So there's just so many layers that have been added to the story, like, even after its release.
And that's interesting because we've talked about how I felt like The Stand lost a little bit of the shine having lived through COVID. I don't know that's the case for this novel. And in fact, this novel almost works better now because we have directly seen the way our culture reacted to a mass death event. Not in this scale, but still, like, in some ways, there's a lot of similarities. So in that way, this novel holds up amazingly well, considering it was written before this crazy thing happened. Okay, I'm going to move into the next section of plot here so we can keep things moving. 20 years later, Kirsten is part of a nomadic group of actors and musicians known as the Traveling Symphony. Kirsten, who was 8 at the time of the outbreak, can remember little of her life before year 0, but clings to a 2-volume set of graphic novels given to her by Arthur before his death, titled Station 11. The troupe operates on a 2-year cycle, touring the Great Lakes region, performing Shakespeare plays and classical music, while Kirsten scavenges abandoned homes for props, costumes, and traces of Arthur in tabloid magazines. The troupe intends to reunite with 2 members they left behind, the pregnant Charlie and her husband Jeremy, at a small town. Upon arriving, they are disturbed to find that their friends are missing, and the town is now under the control of the prophet, who rapes the young girls he claims as his wives. The troupe quickly leaves and goes off-route to the Museum of Civilization, a settlement where they believe they might find their missing friends. En route, they discover a young stowaway who fled the town, as she was promised to the prophet as another bride. Shortly after, members of the troupe begin to disappear until finally the entire troupe is gone, leaving only Kirsten and her friend August. Frightened, they continue on to the museum, hoping to be reunited with the others. Okay, so let's take a moment to talk about post-apocalyptic storyline, which mostly centers on Kirsten, at least at this point, and this traveling symphony. What is your thoughts on this stuff?
I don't know about you, but having read Eye of the World somewhat recently,
Yeah.
did this kind of make you think of I think they're the Tinks, right?
Tinkerers. Well, Tuathuan. They have different names, yeah. It's like these traveling Way of the Leaf, sort of pacifists. Yeah.
Right. Just the similarity of like a traveling troupe that is sort of disconnected from the other societies, like it drew comparison. There's no, the pacifist portion is definitely not the same, but it just got me thinking about that. But
well, it's also connecting to a real world thing where in Shakespeare's times, a lot of theater was performed in this way. You had traveling troupes of actors who would go from town to town and put on productions. And this comes back, 600, 700 years later in this book and is now all of a sudden a thing again. So there's just something, there's like a cyclical thing there that I like.
Yeah. And I think I've mentioned before, but like I kind of am a sucker and like, I can tell when it's not done well, but I really love time skips in stories because it gives a sense of scale and like weight to a story when you get to see characters' perspectives change, characters grow. And in this case, like Kirsten, like we there's these gaps for Kirsten. So like she remembers some of before the pandemic, and then there's like a few years that she doesn't remember and is sort of suppressed, which is again like acknowledged a lot, like this idea of like some people remember the past and some people don't, and the people who do are maybe tortured more and are not able to cope as well. And there's a lot of interesting stuff with that. But I just love a time skip, and there are multiple in this story that allow for, like I said, a sense of scale that you don't get if it's just like, the story happens in a few days. And, different stories are obviously catered to different time periods. But for this one, 20 years going by in a pandemic, a lot of things are going to change.
Yeah, it's true. And like, I was shocked. And at first I was like, I felt a little cheated, right? 20 years later, boom, here's a new character. And I'm like, oh, I just got interested in Jeevan and this whole Arthur storyline and like everything that was going on there. And at this point in the book, like I didn't know how much to trust the author, right? So you're like, oh, I feel a little bit cheated. This is interesting, but man, I wish I could have found out what happened to them. But I knew, I was like, okay, we're going to find out. And it takes a while, though. It kind of takes a while before we circle back and start finding out what happened to this character, because we have a lot of other characters to introduce. This is actually kind of an ensemble, a lot of perspectives. I haven't even talked about the POV that the book is written in. It's really kind of semi-omniscient in a way that is not a very modern convention right now, yet I think is employed really well here. In the same way that like Stephen King writes, honestly, in that semi-omniscient tone, where like she can dive into the psyches of different characters, yet she can give us knowledge like these people would all be dead. Like who is that saying that? It has to just be the narrator or the omniscient narrator, because no one character has that that cosmic perspective. So you get to employ things like that when you do this, which I think is cool. And I think it's done right here. If you're going to do it, this is a good way to do it. Speaking to one thing you said, I had an exact quote. The quote is, "The more you remember, the more you've lost." And I thought that was really telling, and it speaks to what you're talking about. And then, the effects of like PTSD and how that can affect memory and aging, right? Like how over time things start to fade, and there's the loss that is associated with that. All very fascinating and just really well explored here. For me, like I really like this traveling troupe. I found them immediately interesting. I like that we describe all the like sort of petty interpersonal dramas that are playing out between them, and that's very approachable to me and makes them feel human. It's like this group of people who live together, and a lot of them date each other, and there's like, oh, this person used to date this person, and then there's all this like pride in their instruments, and it sounded very much like and I was in band and stuff when I was in like junior high, but I wasn't ever a part of a group like this. But I imagine if you are, this is probably really speaking to you because it felt very true to life, right?
Yeah, and I love that they would address characters as their instruments.
Yeah. The third oboe and the first violin, and then like was it the violins in particular? There was one where it was like they never wanted to adopt a former person's number. So like if the third violin or whatever left and you came in, you became the fourth violin, you didn't take their spot, which I thought was kind of funny because there's like this like history of that, but it's like only this one group that does that. I don't know. It's very interesting stuff. Let's move on. So unbeknownst to Kirsten, Station 11 is an unpublished passion project for Arthur's first wife, Miranda. 14 years before the collapse of civilization, Miranda left an abusive relationship and married Arthur, a friend from her hometown in coastal British Columbia, who has since become famous. As Arthur's fame as an actor hit its peak, Miranda realized he was having an affair with a woman who would become his second wife, Elizabeth. The night that Miranda discovers the affair, she walks out of her home and asks a paparazzo outside if he has a cigarette. The paparazzo turns out to be Jeevan. Years later, when Jeevan is trying to reinvent himself as an entertainment journalist, Arthur gives him an exclusive interview. He is leaving Elizabeth and their young son Tyler to be with another woman. Jeevan reflects on this while he and Frank are quarantining in Frank's apartment. After weeks, they realize that no one is coming to save them. Frank, who is a paraplegic, dies by suicide to spare Jeevan from feeling responsible for him. Jeevan embarks on a journey south and, after many years, finds a new settlement where he marries and becomes the town doctor. In year 0, one of Arthur's friends, Clark, informs Elizabeth that Arthur is dead. Clark and Elizabeth and Tyler happen to be on the same flight from New York City to Toronto to attend Arthur's funeral until it is grounded at the Severn City Airport due to the pandemic. Okay, let's stop there because that's like a ton to react to, and I don't want to go on. Yeah, so Miranda is actually a really important character throughout. She's this first wife of Arthur Leander, who is sort of the core of this book, surrounds this guy. And I wanted to talk about that. Like, why? I have my thoughts, but I want to ask you. Like, why is Arthur Leander at the heart of the story? What role does he play? This like womanizing, I think is fair to say, philandering, whatever you want to call it, guy who is just kind of shitty, but people like him. He's charismatic. He's famous. He at different points is very important to people in their lives, but then he betrays people, and he's also the guy who dies at the start of the book. So he's already a dead character as we're learning more and more about his life.
There's a reason why there's very little from Arthur's like personal point of view, because the people around him are more interesting than him himself, maybe. And there are interesting things about him. He's famous. He's an actor. He's, done all these things, and he deals with the things that a lot of actors deal with fame and that sort of thing. And there's enough there to be an interesting and compelling character, but all of the satellite characters are much more interesting because they're more real. They're not some really famous, really lavish lifestyle who's dealing with, art and fame. They're also like Miranda, for instance, is like expressing her art in a way that's so pure because it's not performative and it's not for anyone other than herself necessarily. And it is deep and it is important, and like the things that we get about it as time goes on, and just the way that like Clark, eventually we get a lot more about him, and like the way that he preserves life pre-pandemic, and all of these characters have so much more going for them, in my opinion. And that's why Arthur is sort of the keystone of the story, but he's not like, we don't care about his perspective as much as the people around him.
It's interesting to the way that all these people compare to Arthur, because he, to me, always seemed to be kind of empty. And
Right.
he's desperate for attention. He's desperate to feel important. And yet that desperation and that desire makes him blind to things, right? Like he's blind to what he has.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, time and again, we see the way he doesn't appreciate the women he's with. And he's always looking to the next thing. And people talk about how, like, when they're talking to him, they're like, is he putting on a performance right now? Like, is he acting?
That was my biggest red flag, is that he's like he's putting on a performance in his everyday life. He'll be he'll be at a dinner with someone having a conversation and be like boisterous and be performing so that the people who are like staring because he's famous are like seeing
well
that.
and she's setting up these these are like opposing sides of the creative world, right? Like there's these kinds of people, and then there's people who are more like Miranda, who have some sort of passion project that is more important to her than it is to get famous. And in fact, she doesn't ever widely publish it, which is an important plot point. And yet that piece of art ends up being very important. And I think that's why the book is drawn from that, right? That's why it's called Station 11. I think we can get into, I think there's multiple reasons, but that's one of the reasons. And to speak on Miranda a little bit, I was really taken with her I felt a lot of empathy and a lot of connection. And just personally, it was getting a little bit too real at times, because she is writing a graphic novel that is set in this undersea, and it's this underwater science fiction-y, pulpy adventure story that she's drawing this art for and spending all this time on, and she's working on it for years. And I have been working on an underwater novel for a few years now. So as I was reading it, I'm like, Jesus, this hit a little bit close to home. But it was really cool for the book to be about the importance of something like that, even when compared to the more societal accepted importance of someone like Arthur, who is like in these big movies and being up for rewards and stuff, which he never wins, I think, notably, but he's been up for Oscars and stuff. And just like the value in both of those art forms. And I don't know, her story is almost about like how that art, her Station 11, meant a ton to her. And throughout her life, it was something that was powerful and important. And it ends up being powerful and important in both a good and bad way to Tyler and Kirsten. And this one person's personal art having a personal connection with just two other people, and yet can have massive implications to the lives of thousands, if not more. That's profound. And that talks about the power of art in that way, and how it can be formative for people, how it can change people's lives. Yeah, and I think it's really cool. And there's this mystery about Miranda, of like what happens to her. And unfortunately, she's one of the only people we follow who does die from the pandemic, and tragically so. And the mystery of the fates of all of these characters is something that continues to interest me, right? Because we skip ahead and we don't know all these people who we've met, like what happened to them.
I was really pleased with the decision to make it a graphic novel as well, right? Like, as someone who really appreciates the medium of graphic novels and comics, mm-hmm. I loved that, like, we got the situations where people were like turning their nose up to it, not seeing it as real art, and saying like, you know, I can't even get engaged with this story. And like, to draw attention to that, I think is cool, because I you know, it's out there. It's like, it's becoming more popular to like, it's becoming more accepted, but like, it wasn't for a really long time. And I think still to this day, people will still put it in the category of like cartoons, and animation in general has some of that too. And you know, it's just this throwaway pulpy sort of storytelling that like doesn't have a lot of significance. It's just printed on a 25-cent piece of paper, and like, you know, people used to pick it up, but there's so much more to the storytelling that's there because of the availability of being able to get those stories out to people, right? Like, the medium has allowed for some amazing storytelling, and obviously we've covered a lot on the podcast, And I just thought that was a great decision, especially from a novel that is like, in a sense, more literary and more interested in the concept of art.
When you're bringing in just another art form, right, into this tapestry that is talking about all kinds of different art forms. So another thing from this section that I was thrilled to find out is the moment where Miranda goes outside and it's Jeevan is there, this guy that we hadn't really touched base with in a while. And all of a sudden we find out he's there because we heard like a throwaway detail that he used to be like in the paparazzi before he became like a journalist. And then sure enough, he's at this house, he's at this party, and he interacts with Miranda, who's this character who up till now has been totally disconnected only through Arthur connection. So it was always cool to see these little connections between characters, and that continues to happen as the book progresses. And it's always a fun little reveal, like, oh shit, they knew each other. Our main characters actually met at this one point in their lives and didn't realize the significance of this meeting.
One of the main connections that I think we should draw at this point too is there was this prophet that's been mentioned in Kirsten's storyline, and he's raping young girls, and it's very clearly like religiously motivated, and there's some power to it. And then as we get a little further in the story, I think we've kind of gotten to this point, right, where we're seeing that like Arthur, Tyler, and Clark were all on the same flight together.
Yeah, that's my next part of the plot here. So let me read that. Clark, Elizabeth, and Tyler happen to be on the same flight from New York City to Toronto to attend Arthur's funeral until it is grounded at the Severn City Airport due to the pandemic. The passengers, having nowhere to go, create a settlement in the airport, and Clark becomes the curator of the Museum of Civilization, where he gathers artifacts such as iPhones, laptop computers. While most of the airport survivors adapt to their new life, Elizabeth and Tyler embrace religious zealotry, believing that the pandemic happened for a reason and spared those who were good. After 2 years, they leave with a religious cult. So let's just stop for a second and talk about that. That's what you were just talking about. And I love that Elizabeth has this, and we meet her in the past. We meet her in a flashback for the first time, and she is the second wife of Arthur. We meet her when she's already sort of having this affair, and Miranda's there, and she knows that it's happening, and it's this kind of terrible dinner party.
And that dinner party is important too, because most of the characters are there. Clark is there, Elizabeth is there, Arthur's there, Miranda's there, Jeevan's there.
And Kirsten is viewing it as a photo we were talking about earlier, this very important dinner party, right? And at this party, she says, I believe everything happens for a reason. Everything happens for a reason. She says it multiple times. And it just seems like kind of a banal thing that people say. It's very common. You hear this from people a lot, especially people who are very religious. And I love that it is the sort of the beginning point of the main villain of our book comes from this belief that everything happens for a reason, and how that idea is almost poisonous. And when the society falls, and she keeps repeating that over and over again as her little mantra to herself, it's like a comfort, right? Like, God loves me. Everything happens for a reason. I must have been spared because I'm a good person. And she says that, and her son, this very impressionable, up to this point, he's just playing video games and kind of just nothing, 8 or 9 year old, he imprints that, and it makes it part of his core identity. And he begins to believe that he was spared for a reason, and that reason is he is a prophet. And there's this massive reveal towards the end of the book that Tyler is the prophet who has been doing all these heinous things, the son of Arthur Leander. So if you look at the legacy there, it's like Arthur was a pretty terrible person. And then at the end of his life, I do like that he had decided he was going to give away all of his wealth, and he had maybe changed his will. There was some indication that he was following through with that. He was going to give away all of his wealth and be the guy who gave it all away and went to live with his son. So I don't completely hate Arthur, even though he does some really despicable thends. But Tyler becomes terrible, and it's really interesting that he also had this page from Station 11, and he ends up naming his dog the same thing and all this stuff that Kirsten imprinted on, yet takes very different lessons from it. And the memory of his father is one thing, but then his mother and her everything happens for a reason saying becomes just absolutely poisonous to this guy, and he ends up internalizing that and believing that anything he does is forgiven because it has been basically co-signed by God. you are right. And boy, do we see that happening in our real world all the time. And I love that she is able to take that and say, like, this shit is actually really bad.
Kirsten has the thought at some point that maybe Tyler, the prophet, because he remembered the past, she speculated that he remembered all of the years from back pre-pandemic in through post-pandemic, and she's sort of thinking about how it's a blessing that she doesn't remember that 1 year gap, and the way that can change someone, and the impressionable nature of like someone going through something like this. Like we see a few scenes where Tyler sees like adults not handling the pandemic well, and he sort of has these like glassy-eyed moments where you're like, oh shit, like he's definitely internalizing this, and you don't pick up on that right away until you get the reveal later
I
on.
wanted to ask you, when did you know he was the prophet?
I don't think I knew until it was pretty much gotten to the point where it was obvious.
Okay, so I had a particular moment where I was 100% I knew, and then I had some moments before that where I was starting to suspect. But the moment I knew was the moment that he was preaching to the dead, the airplane full of the dead people.
Oh yeah, I knew at that
when
point
Clark
as well,
comes up to him and he's like doing this little sermon to the dead people. I was like, oh fuck, he's definitely the prophet. 100% knew at that point. I had some suspicions early on because I was wondering who's the prophet here, because we had been hearing this mystery that he came from this place, this airport, and I was like, who could it be? And I thought, like, could it be the son? And I just kind of had a moment where I thought about it. I had thought about it more. I probably should have realized it definitely was, but like, I wasn't confirmed yet until this moment. That was the moment I was like, yeah, 100%.
Well, and then that same, like, he does that sermon thing, and then I think in the same chapter they like Elizabeth and Tyler leave the airport, and so it's like that's like pretty much the full on reveal, unless you didn't pick up on some of the smaller. I mean, like I think that's most people would pick up on it there, but it was still a heavy reveal, and it's like the idea, like you said, the lineage of Arthur to then Tyler. And had Arthur actually been there for his childhood, maybe something would have changed. Maybe some piece of him would have changed, because he was there for Kirsten's, kind of. You know, not a lot, but he had an impression on her. And like that idea of like the absent father and
That's a good point, because what does he do? He ignores the signs of a heart attack, we learn at the end of the book, and goes out on stage anyway because he wants to perform. He's called to perform. And you're totally right. Like, he almost dies for his art in that way. And even though he talked a big game about wanting to be there for his son, he ultimately isn't. And he ends up dying in pursuit of this art that he has his entire life chased. So there is tragedy there, right? And I think it's important. Now, I'm not a King Lear expert. I did read it in high school, long time ago. But I know that book is all about legacy and about, like, you know, it's tragedy, right? It's one of Shakespeare's famous tragedies, right? So it is and there's like references to Leander playing King Lear and wearing a crown, and I think those two characters, if you're like really versed in King Lear, I'm sure there's a lot of similarities here, and that he's this tragic figure. So I think that's very specifically drawn. Also, Midsummer's Night Dream, as mentioned early on, I thought that was there was very specific correlations being drawn there too. So if you're really into Shakespeare, I'm sure you can get a lot out of this that I was maybe missing, because I actually have never read that one. I'm kind of aware of it, but I've never read it. Anyway, gosh, there's so much that happens. Let's move on to the last bit of plot I have here, and then we can just kind of touch on, you know, any dangling threads we want to touch on. So in the present, Kirsten and August find a group of the prophet's men holding Saeed, a member of their troupe, hostage. They kill the men and free Saeed, who explains that their father Dieter was killed, while another hostage escaped, warned the troupe, and sent them to another road, explaining how they went missing. The trio leave for the Severn City airport, but Kirsten is soon discovered by the prophet. Just before he is about to kill her, he refers to the Undersea, a place from the Dr. 11 comics. Kirsten quotes lines from Dr. 11, distracting the prophet long enough that a younger Sentry, having a crisis of faith, shoots and kills him before taking his own life. The trio continues to the Museum of Civilization, where they are reunited with Charlie, Jeremy, and the rest of the troupe. Clark, who has lived in the museum for 20 years, realizes who Kirsten is, her attachment to Arthur, and that the prophet was Tyler Leander. Clark takes Kirsten up to the control tower of the airport where, through a telescope, he shows her that there is a town to the south with electric lights, suggesting that civilization is beginning to take root again. 5 weeks later, Kirsten leaves the traveling symphony for the town to the south. She gives one copy of Dr. Eleven to Clark's museum. He begins to read it and recognizes a scene that is borrowed from a dinner party which he, Arthur, and Miranda once attended. And that's the end of the book. Okay, so let's talk about just anything like that, and then anything else we haven't touched on yet that we want to touch on, because there's a lot. First thing I want to say is that I absolutely love the entire sequence at the airport. It was one of my favorite parts of the entire book. When Clark lands at this airport, they all get sort of quarantined, and then this group of strangers develops this little mini community and tries to survive. I don't know. I found that really fascinating. Someone who flies like a decent amount, I've definitely had thoughts about like weird things happening in airports, and like it's such a like weird liminal space we talk about a lot. Is always really interesting. And the idea of having to live in a place that is designed for you to be in for a very transitory amount of time.
Well, and they talk about like the idea of like being stranded at the airport. Everybody's had that experience where like you miss a flight or something gets delayed and you're stuck.
What if you were there forever?
And then being stuck there forever. And then having like I kept thinking about like they jump 15, 20 years or whatever. And I'm like, holy shit, like seeing nothing but an airport for that period of time would be so like off-putting for one, but like at some point it becomes a home, and they create, and then it becomes like, oh yeah, this person's hanging out in the in the food court, and this person's over, and it becomes sort of, you make it more than it was before. And I don't know, I found it to be really interesting too. I love that, all of that community.
So many good details come out there, like the people, the slow way in which our accepted norms and laws and stuff like that start to fall, right? Like when they don't want to like raid the kitchen for food because it's like illegal, they don't want to steal. And then the guy's like, don't worry, I'll put it on my card. And he sets it down. And then it's like that card sat there untouched for 100 days. And you're like, oh shit. So like, this is like the last time someone potentially offered to pay for something on a credit card, because credit cards are no longer a thing and they don't know that yet. But like they're not at this moment, and like any sort of ownership of this food is long gone. It is just there now. All these people are dead, right? So, but the way that there are these like slow abandonments of these accepted norms is so true to life. Like I totally see things playing out this way. Like I believed the way things go in this book so much that I found it really powerful in that way.
I do think this final section is where it really turns into the pandemic post-apocalyptic story that you were expecting, in a sense.
It's the transitory period we hadn't gotten, right? It's the true transition, yeah. Although we get a little bit of it with Jeevan in the city. A little bit of that.
Right.
But he and his brother are just like locked away in their apartment, and they really don't experience much.
Right.
Yeah.
But even the other like storylines that are going on, like the stuff where like Kirsten and August are like out. They've been separated from the troupe, and like they're running on the run from the prophet and his men, and that all feels in line with what you would expect. And I'm not saying it's like reductive in that way. I'm just saying that it's like these are the things that you expect to happen in a post-apocalyptic story, with like the people firing guns and like not being able to reach understandings with each other, and people being irrational, and cults and powers that be like that. And but yeah, specifically with Clark and everything that goes on in the airport, I loved the one of my favorite details. You said the terminal, some of the terminal stuff. One of my favorite details is that Clark decides to start this museum. Like that to me has always, the keepers of knowledge and stories always speak to me, and I've always wanted to write a story that has a character like this at the heart of it, where like you're preserving something important, and like Clark seemingly, that's his life work at that point, is just preserving what life was, and people are so fascinated by it and wanting to come back and see it. And so the idea of a museum in that sense is
and
cool.
It was undercut earlier in the narrative, right, where the Kirsten and August meet a character on the side of on the road, who talks about the museum, and he's like, why Like, what's the point of any of that? Like, look around you, that's all over with now, kind of thing. Like, so, I love that, like, all this stuff is sort of analyzed from multiple angles, right? As much as it's presented as, like, being really cool, it's also, like, there's this whole discussion about kids who are born after the fall. Do we educate them about what came before or not? And there's this, debate about it. And ultimately, it seems like they're landing on, yes, we should, but, like, there is a debate to be had about it, and I think it's interesting that the book engages in that. To speak about the sort of actual, more actiony, post-apocalyptic, dramatic, the prophet is chasing them, and they're Kirsten is really good at throwing knives, and she kills somebody with a knife throw, and I really like the tattoos, by the way. I thought that was really interesting. That's all cool, and in a way, it is the more expected route to take. Yet it's informed by something unusual, and that's her being part of this troupe, and then the thing that really stands out to me in that is the interview that she has with this guy who's writing a newspaper, like the first newspaper to really start back up, we imagine. And we get these direct interview moments written out in the book in like again, like a direct way, like as if a transcription. And I love that she's employing different forms of storytelling here to do that, and I think that's really clever to do. And again, we don't get it all in one go. We get chunks of it here or there when it becomes important to the story. And what she very specifically does not explain the meaning behind her tattoos, the knife tattoos, to that guy who's interviewing her, and exploring why I think is interesting too, because she talks about how through studying the tabloids of Arthur, she has an idea about like a permanent record, and she thinks about legacy and what is going to be remembered. And I think she realizes that if she talks about the fact that she has killed multiple people, and that's what these things mean, she will forever be remembered as someone who killed people. And she doesn't want, like, she hates that she had to do it. And she talks about he asks her, like, when you think about, I think he says this time, what do you think about, or the past? She says she thinks about killing. And it's the fact that she had to kill. And that was all off the record. So it's interesting, right? Because it's an important part of her story, and it's an important part of her identity, yet she doesn't want it to be a part of her legacy. And that's a cool distinction, right? Like, we can have things that are important to us, that are important to who we are, and are something that we've had to grapple with and learn from, yet we might not want everything to be part of our sort of permanent record that is the world's going to remember us by. And I don't know, I thought that was an interesting nuance to explore in this setting of all settings.
Another thing that I feel like we haven't really addressed in terms of like what it means to the story is like the actual goings on of the Dr. 11 comics, and the way that there's like parallel to the story that we're reading, and like the importance of that, the looking back at story, and how even the author writing it at the time can't understand like how the lasting implications of these stories will affect the world. But the Dr. 11 comics allow Tyler basically to like justify a lot of his things along with his religious background. And for Kirsten, it's like this ongoing beam of hope and this idea of like life finding a way. And it's sort of that Star Trek idea that they talk about, like survival alone is insufficient, I think. Which again, that's drawing on a very genre, pulpy Star Trek of all things. Yet she has it tattooed on her body because it's so important to her. And it's even talked about like some characters are like, "Why do you have that tattooed on?" It's so kind of cliche or whatever, and she's just like, "No, it's meaningful." And that's kind of what this story is. It's back and forth, right? It's having the conversation. It's not telling you to land one way or another on it. But to where it lands to me, a creative, someone wanting to create, it starts to lean into like the art being myth, sort of like art being that important. I think the story obviously comes down somewhere, especially with that quote, meaning survival isn't enough.
Exactly, right? Like, so you strip away the modern world and you reduce everyone to survivalism, and you're able to gain this perspective on our modern lives and how ridiculous a lot of it is, and how everybody's kind of looking at their phones and not appreciating the interconnectedness and the ease in which we are able to travel and communicate. But at the same time, it's not like when you take all of that away, life is better. And this book explores how that is ultimately the goal, is you want to be in a place where that is possible. You want those modern wonders. You want to be able to get on a plane and fly somewhere. You want to be able to instantly communicate with someone across the world, and how that's actually kind of magical. And maybe just we should appreciate it a little bit more, but not that we should wish it wasn't the case.
I had a quote that I pulled for this specific scenario. So there's this part that says, and this is when he's looking out at the city as the collapse of society is happening in the apartment in Toronto, I think. So Jeevan found himself thinking about how human the city is, how human everything is. We bemoaned the impersonality of the modern world, but that was a lie, it seemed to him. It had never been impersonal at all. There had always been a massive, delicate infrastructure of people, all of them working unnoticed around us. So
true, and so important today, right? As we hear about supply chain, as we hear about essential workers, and how our society is held up by people doing these kind of jobs, delivering things, working in factories. And society is held up by all these people, and we take them for granted. And if you start taking that away, everything falls apart. And I think that is a powerful thing to notice. And then it's interesting to talk about art in that regards to that, right? And we see artists here struggling because if you get into a creative life, sometimes you will feel like the things you are doing are sort of ephemeral, or can be perceived as self-indulgent, or not concrete in the way that someone who works with their hands or works, directly can see the effects of the things they're doing, like a doctor who's saving lives directly, like things like that all seem more important in some lights. And yet this book explores the ways in which art is also important. Maybe not saying it's more important, but it is also important in its own way. And I love that you talked about how Miranda wrote this book. She never knows the effect it has. And yet it could end up being profoundly important for someone like Kirsten, who could go on to become profoundly important. That's not confirmed, but it feels like it could be. And at the very least, unfortunately, Tyler. And
right.
the unknown effects of our art is a fascinating topic to think about as someone who writes, right? Like, who might have read a short story I wrote and had it like inform their life in some way, and how could that play out for them in some way? And in some way I'll never know, I could potentially affect somebody.
I do love the dual sort of messaging here, right? Like, this is bringing up this idea and then also asking you to analyze how this story is changing your perspective and how you will think of things going forward too. So,
well, and to think about the content of your creations too, right? And like think about the ways they can actually affect people. I think that is like kind of a next level thought as a writer, because the first thing you're trying to do is just write a fucking story that makes sense and is entertaining. But the next level of that is starting to think about the effects it could have, which is, super fascinating.
You were talking about Kirsten and like Tyler and their connection to Dr. Eleven. I think we have to talk about that scene also at the end, where like this child, this guard or young person, like turns on Tyler, ultimately shooting him in this like last moment where Kirsten's about to be executed. And, Arthur and Saeed are off to the side, and it's this really surprising moment. You hear sort of the cavalry coming in the background. There's like, I think you can hear like the carts coming from the troop. So they're like potentially going to show up at the last second, but Tyler's like, they'll be too late. And ultimately this kid turns and kills him. And I wanted to ask you, like, why do you think this kid did this?
Yeah. So he's not a true believer. He says that himself. He's just sort of caught up in the things. He's just going along with it. It's a thing to do. And he regrets some of the stuff that he had to do. And at certain points, he's like sort of crying and seems like he has a lot of guilt. And that's hinting at what's going to come here. And I don't know. I mean, it could has something to do with like the next generation, right? And the way that generations pass on to each other knowledge, and they affect each other, they fuck each other up, right? Famously, Philip Larkin talks about the way our parents fuck us up and we fuck up our kids in turn. And that's happening here, right? And I I think that's what she's going for, and you can see also that you can opt out, right? Like you can say, you know what, I'm not going to follow this thing. I'm going to make the decision for myself. And this kid does that.
Well, interestingly, like he was a guard before that they had encountered, right?
Yeah, he was on the way out of the city, yeah.
If you really wanted to, which I don't think the book wants you to, but if you really wanted to, you could go in and say, everything happens for a reason, just like Tyler believed, just like his mom believed. This kid that they had already encountered before comes back around and kills Tyler in this...
You're going to create another Tyler one day with that thought, man.
Right. But what I'm saying is there's no rhyme or reason to it almost at some point. Like this child did it motivated, but at the same time, it was the only person who could have possibly done it in that moment.
And what is the reason, I guess, is the ultimate question. I think the reasons are the things we make them ourselves. Like or understanding that reason and purpose and fulfillment and legacy, all of that is human. All of that comes from within and is ultimately subjective. And I think Clark really appreciates that. I think he has a moment where he even talks about like that's his view of the world. And I think that that's closest to the one that the book is sort of espousing here. And so my argument would be that the kid, his actions may seem cosmically linked, right? Just like how all these characters interweaving and how they're all connected can seem cosmic, but it's cosmic at the heart of it because of like this art thing, right? And how that almost is the web that interweaves all these people. And so in that sense, it's not cosmic, it's very human.
Right. Or ultimately random, ultimately chaos and randomness is what...
And finding order within that. And then, of course, you can say, like, oh, that's all cosmically driven. And I think that just comes down to personal belief and stuff. But
exactly, yeah. It comes down to, like, the idea of free will. So let's get into that conversation. I'm just kidding.
Well, I think we'll have to save that for another time because we're running a bit long here. I feel like I have so much left to talk about with the story and thoughts about what it means. And that's why I'm so glad that we are going to be talking about it for 2 more weeks as we tackle the show. We're going to be talking about the first 5 episodes, I believe it is, and then following that up with the next 5 episodes. That way we can actually dive into some of the specifics of what goes on. It won't be a super deep dive into every single scene because it's just a lot of TV, but it's also not just a complete overview, which it would be if we tackled the entire season in one. So we're hoping that that's going to be a decent mix for this one. We're still figuring out how to cover TV on this podcast, but we hope that you will join us for that. If you enjoyed our discussion of Station 11, the book, we would love for you to let us know in the form of a rating and review, especially if you're a new listener. We would love to have you leave us some sort of rating and review, whatever app you chose to listen on. Give us a like if you're on YouTube. And then, beyond that, tell a friend. If you know someone who's read this book and likes it and you think they'd enjoy our coverage, share it with them because we are a fairly small but scrappy, I like to think, podcast, and we definitely rely a lot on word of mouth. So if you can tell a friend, that would be awesome.
And definitely make sure to share our stuff on all social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film.
And if you would like to support this podcast in a financial way, first off, you're awesome. You're amazing. Thank you for thinking about that. We are on Patreon, and we have lots of bonus content on there. We have a way that you could get like a mug with our logo on it, actually a special logo that was designed just for Patreon. You can go check that out. We have like t-shirt, hoodie, all kinds of different stuff, but then also just bonus episodes where we talk about adaptation adjacent stuff, other adaptations. Like if you ever like see that we covered like, oh, you covered Carrie from the 70s. Have you talked about the new one? Well, we're going to be talking about the new one this month. So that's the kind of stuff we do over on our Patreon, and we'd love to have you support us on there, patreon.com/inktofilm.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. I'm so excited to be back doing this. It feels like I am rejuvenated and regenerated and feeling good, feeling better, feeling excited for this year and this coverage. And I hope everybody sticks with us for this one and sticks with us throughout the year. We'd love to have you along for the ride. And until next time,
keep adapting.